have to yell, I think, Brian.
Okay, well, I will try to yell, and if I just keep dipping, sort of my tone keeps dropping down, please tell me. I'll keep looking out here so I can see the people in the top, but forgive me if I do that because the image is important. So hopefully I can meet some of the objectives that Gina has set here this evening, and it does bring about sort of a caring idea, or more of an idea about how to make this presentation. And I'm trying not to make a typical presentation of some of our work, our historic work, and trying to be thinking about the things that really do make a building and what is embedded in a building from the point of view of designers and makers. So I think it's actually, these things are influenced by many, many things. My story about it will be very much, I think it's very much about location, as Robin mentioned, and so therefore mine is very much a Brisbane tale. I'm just going to check, can people hear me? Yep, we can. Very much a Brisbane tale, because in Brisbane, I think wherever you are, it's not about Brisbane or Melbourne or Sydney or Singapore, but I think there are a whole lot of methodologies that one develops to be able to work within one's setting. And Brisbane's is very particular with respect to authority approval, I think with respect to client ambition, with respect to who's available to work on the projects. And I think that then brings us to the point that I think rather than an individual being involved, the projects that we are involved with, there's numbers of things that are factual about it, and that is, of all of the projects we've done, there's been many, many, many people involved. It's never one person. There's never one designer. There's never one maker. There's a whole lot of people that contribute to the process. So I'll try to describe that in a number of examples. And then I think the other thing, depending on the project that one is involved with, in the first project, which is a residential project, which some people know about, which is the Sea House, which has a reputation of being very finely wrought, but then there are other buildings that we have done where we need to set the agenda, if you like, and try to develop a process, or what we've described as sphere of influence, so that everybody can all work together in making the best outcome. So to emphasise or to heighten ambition and to somehow be able to ensure the best skills are brought to the project. So I think this thing about sphere of influence, obviously in this house, not so critical, but in other houses, what is it that one does as a designer, and what are you thinking about? There's a materiality, but I think it starts with things at a much broader scale. What is one thinking about from the point of view of, depending on the building, whether it's a public building or a private building, about city making and urban matters. There's obviously things about form, and there's a sort of architect who will think about form beyond anything else. And where we come from, and I think this house is a fantastic example, it's about the experience that one can portray within a house, and so that can be embedded in architecture and the decisions we make irrespective of scale. Introductory commentary also goes on. I think therefore the buildings are a consequence of a massive range of negotiations. So it's never a process of one individual, as I say, making decisions and everybody else falling into place and complying. We are the buildings that are presented, and most buildings, I'd suggest, in contemporary world are the outcome of the input of many, many, many people, and it's really a process of negotiation, how you manoeuvre that to the final outcome. So through this I can show you examples where it was sort of linear, and processes and examples of where there are a whole lot of thoughts that were thrown by the wayside. Before we go on, good thing it didn't work. This image of the Sea House, I think there's 7 materials here, all of which were their final rendering, if you like, was a consequence of us talking to the makers themselves, us talking to manufacturers, and there's a process that results in this composition that people look at and think, oh wow, the architects have done an amazing job, but the important point here is about the fact that it is a consequence of negotiation with all the people involved. Now, excuse me, I'll just get this going, I hope. So for the first thing, the Sea House. The Sea House came about, for those who know it, our client was is a civil contractor. So he brought to the project things that we could never imagine, and that is the ability to do this incredible concrete. He had somebody working for him who had been working for that group for 40 years, and this was his sort of homage, if you like, or dedication back to his client, his family client that he had been working with for a long, long time. So the building was entirely sculpted and shifted and remade utilising concrete before anybody else got involved, apart from the sort of the servicing that's required with respect to obviously plumbing and electrical work and so forth. And so we extended the idea of or leveraged off the thing that he brought to us, is about what is it about concrete that one can work with. It can become, and we describe it as though it's a remade terrain. There's a massive amount of cut and fill. You can reorchestrate a building site. You can actually start to consider it as the ground, as it once was, and almost like an artefact that then we add things to. And so the concrete can be used internally and externally. There's so many things about it that we could sort of overlay as a proposition, but yet the technique of actually how to achieve that was brought from the other side, from the people making it. And then we made the timber things. We worked again with a group of people who made the timber buildings that then adjusted the concrete ground plane, if you like, and converted it into something that could be occupied. And it's not about form, it's an accumulation of moments in the building that are really essentially designed through obviously the tectonic, but also the tectonic is developed out of an idea which is about the experience of the house. I'll get in sync with this, I'm sorry. So after a year and a half, we spent a long period. What our client also brought to this project was the desire to make, and we didn't realise this in the first instance, this was essentially one of our very first commissions. When we first left university, we being Timothy Hill and Brian Donovan at Donovan Hill, our client approached us about this project. We had no idea. He didn't say, I want a marvellous house that I'm going to live in forever. He said, I just want a house that I want to be able to live my life in, and it just evolved as an idea of how a house could be made for life and to suit the various organisational requirements of a house for life. We got to the point, therefore, of him saying, well, I'll spend X amount of money, but I've got two choices of how to spend it. I can get a lot of people there very quickly, and in his view and in our view, have a lesser quality, or he can spend the same amount of money over a long period of time and have just a very, very few people on site. So the concrete team was there until they finished and they walked off the job. And then the timber people came in, and there was essentially two people who built the house thereafter, and the entire project was over 5 years. So part of the way of working with timber, and I can talk about any part of the house, but tonight just talk about one particular part, and that is working with the timber people in the selection of timbers and how that all developed. And there's various species of timber. So I think if one thinks about makers and intelligence, clearly there's research about timbers. Celery top pine, an available timber, Tasmanian timber which was used for joinery on the left-hand side of the screen. New Zealand kauri was used for an interior room. I'll describe these in more detail later. That was once a rum vat and then was cut on site. Different characteristics, of course, the things that one is thinking about are to do with maintenance, longevity, how it reacts with the concrete, smell, workability by the people involved on site. There's a lot of white beech, Australian white beech, in the image on the left-hand side, which was selected for the fact that it does not react with the concrete. It will go white over time if you can keep it mould-free. So the beech was used, therefore, for timber decking and some trellis items, some landscape items. And the right-hand image is American rock maple, which was selected. Obviously, we are orchestrating this thing, but selected from the point of its value and warmth as an interior material, but it's hopeless outside, very hard to use in an interior situation, and matched the sort of colour rendition that we were anticipating for the house. So to talk about some things in more detail, therefore, about how these things come about, and you can see already, I hope, that I'm emphasising the fact that it's not one person's decision. There's a group of people, there's a design group, or not even a design group, a working group that work towards making the outcome. And we, to be honest, when we started the project, didn't have this image. We had an idea, but it was never drawn. As an elevation and as an experience, it was never drawn. We had a set of drawings that satisfied the authority process, approval process, so we had obviously a plan and a section and an elevation, but all of the detail and the things that one can see in these buildings was never drawn as an elevation, but was drawn through a process of working with our client of sort of moments of time and how each place would contribute to an overarching sort of composition and an overarching idea of how the house could be used. And so I'll try to talk about things from the point of view of the pragmatic overlay and potentially the pragmatic requirements and the experiential overlay that an architect and designers can bring to it. So in this instance, the concrete shell was here. You saw that in the previous image. There's a building here which is a timber building which is made for occupation in the north of the house. It's a courtyard plan. This sits, in fact I'll give you one description about the house just to see it here in elevation, because there's an arrival point. There's a main level which includes kitchen, living space, but a major outdoor room which is under a roof. There's a formal living space over yonder. Hopefully you can see my pointer. And there's some bedrooms in the rear of the house. So it's essentially a U-shaped plan with a major room is actually outside in the centre of the house, a courtyard-shaped plan. So then to make that work, as I follow it through, this space here is like an adjunct building to the kitchen. If you imagine it as a centre of daily life throughout the entire life of the house, whether one is there. Our client commissioned us when he was a single man, and we had to imagine all of the ways that this house would be used over an entire life. And since he's been living there, we have gone through, and us with him, single man, him with his girlfriend. He's been married. He had his wedding celebration there. He now has 2 children, etc., etc. It is set up to imagine how it's going to be for his parents to live in the house if and when that occurs. There is an independent part that allows guests to come to the house, and therefore the central courtyard is developed from a sort of organisational arrangement, thinking that that is a way to organise the house so it can essentially give it a massive range of flexibility and to be able to organise the sort of the subsectors of the house. So somebody can come into the courtyard, go to if one is a guest and gets past the frontline security, then you're actually able to get access to, for example, a little guest room. Very, very modest, the major part of the room. A lot of the rooms here are very modest except for the scale of this sort of central space. To move on, our drawings, this is a cross-section and a plan, and I'm sorry you won't be able to read it, of this building here. The practical requirements include this building was always imagined as a landscape, so the concrete is a ground, the landscape grows all over it, and we can see ultimately these photographs are reasonably recent. There's a screen here which is a trellis for the landscape. It's also a pool fence because there's an occupied space inside. It's also extending that idea to how one experiences the room, a sort of trellis, if you like, and a set of battens in a very Queensland idiom where the light filters through it from the north. At night it's a lantern, it's like tent-like at the top, so the light illuminates other spaces. All of which is developed, and I think I have it in the next image, from the interior. Excuse me, lost my button. Developed a set of planes, if you like, an outside plane, which was the one we saw from the outside, which was the trellis. It has an openable window sash system, which you can see here, so it is a ventilating Queensland room. We do have insects, so there's an insect protection layer. At the upper part, as I mentioned, it's the intention to be a lantern, so the illumination of it is critical, and how that then becomes enigmatic in the space through the evenings. By day, the way the light comes through it, and you get very dappled light on the interior. So all of these things are orchestrated from understanding the way that the construction and the materiality can enhance the ideas that really are about experience. I'm not sure how you normally conduct these. I can just keep going, but if somebody really desperately wants to ask me a question, please do. And here it is finished but unoccupied. And to point out a few of those moments in the building, obviously an occupied edge, it is a tall space, part of the experience of occupation. We understand and argue absolutely is about sort of making comparisons. So within the dwelling and all buildings, hopefully, there is a comparisons of scale, tall and short, fine and rough, light and shade. We've all talked about those things, being in a cave or being in a tent. If one is exposed to a range of experiences and then has a choice of how to enjoy them, we think it's an enduring thing that one can sort of embed in a building. I've jumped forward because I will describe this, but the idea extending how in the materiality of these things, how the tent and the woven upper part is basket-like. We were at that point in time genuinely thinking how this and the fabric was sailcloth. It is a tent, and so how in a building that is obviously made for life, then you can rely on very sort of primitive emotions, and so this canvas, if you like, or translucent material flaps in the breeze and adjusts the light and so forth. So, and because it's an independent building that you occupy and you get inside, then one can believe that you actually are in a garden or in an arbour or in a tent or in a light fitting, all those things. And I think another thing that one can, everybody has their own interpretation, and that's fine because it's never one thing. Oops, I'm sorry, did I just pick somebody in the eye? Part of the way this developed and working with, there were two people essentially with the timber work, and I'll point them out. Essentially the load-bearing framing work by person number one, Jim Evans, Phil Green, the second person doing all of the sort of movable parts, the joinery parts. All of this incidentally is the celery top pine installation. So the battens here, the woven battens, are actually offcuts of other timbers. We worked, one can imagine when you look at things like the frame and the boards, that there's a very particular way of, and of course there is a particular way of deciding that, but in fact the thing that influenced it was that it's quite a rare timber species. Nothing was cut, all the timber was second hand in this building. So all of it had a previous life. We only know about the previous life of the New Zealand kauri, which was rumvats. But when the celery top pine was available, we were able to find our client found a very large or a suitably large quantity of it, but it was already cut in particular pieces, so then we had to work with those pieces with the makers to actually work out which piece would suit each circumstance. So the sort of the rafter detail, if you like, is a composite rafter made of 3 pieces of timber that was available and already cut because there wasn't large timber available. So a lot of the tectonic and the detail in those decisions is through, as I say, this process. Once one comes into the sort of formal space, the living room, I'm purposely not showing the building that's, for those who don't know it, it's very hard to see where one is in here, but I think it's not like a classic talk, if that's okay, but one arrives in the courtyard in the centre of the house, then can move into a hall. The hall has been detailed so it seems as though it's outside. So the exterior finish becomes interior. A shiplap detail in timber work is actually made where the tongue is made of translucent material, so it's as though it's a screen. So the idea of external screens and internal screens are all made one. Very, very precise, and people don't necessarily understand it in the first instance, but these are the things that one embeds through the process that actually ultimately do make a massive difference. So when one arrives in here, there is this ambiguity, am I inside or outside? There's an independent building that's made, which is the formal, as it was here in the concrete enclosure and as it now is. So a full timber enclosure was made. Here the New Zealand kauri, as I mentioned. Sorry. As part of why one would make a you can sort of extend all one's thinking and try to orchestrate about how do you make occupiable space. If you extend the idea of the concrete being the landscape, the concrete being enclosure, the concrete sort of being the weathered surface and making these fine interior parts, then this room, which is a shaped room, actually becomes one of the jewels. It's shaped so that, again, the pragmatic requirements of actually how you use a room, through its shaping, we made a storeroom, so it's a large room where the furniture needs to change. If you imagine the way this space works, you need places to put the furniture. You need to be able to change these things through the course of the day or the week or the year. There are places for occupation without furniture. Another little anecdote about the project was that because our client recognised that this was a house for life, he understood, and we are still actually involved in the house of putting in furniture, but in the first instance, he would sit and we would sit on concrete or timber lumps and bumps. So there's a way of occupying the building edge. And it's its own room, so you actually recognise that it has its own ceiling, its own soffit, so very much a graphic idea of, in a sense, extending the thing about the dual proposition of this protecting ground plane and enclosure of concrete and the refined parts that are made for occupation in the house. Some befores and afters. There is a, which you will see directly, quite significant views to Brisbane City. Brisbane does operate in a way that views are important in Brisbane City. Brisbane, of course, those who know it, is a very centric city. Just in general values, if you have a view to the city, irrespective of the orientation, then it seems to influence land value. This house does have a view to the city, but also cross-axial views to landscapes and sort of setting up plates and moments that the way that the house can operate, including the furniture store that I described previously. There's a platform on top, and we did imagine it almost as the concrete as a massive light source where there's skylights on the top, as you can see. The light bounces off the concrete and comes into the interior. Also overlaid with a way that, like this, there will be special events, and there have been special events in the house, and that is a platform that I've seen a small quartet sit on and play wonderful music at the occasion of the wedding. And extended the thinking about a Queensland building and how is it that a Queensland building, we know the typical thing about people understand about battens and light and shade and filtered light and so forth. And because of the idea of concrete and these absolutely refined parts of the timber, then this building likewise has a translucent tongue detail that allows for enclosure. And the reason it has tongues rather than, sorry, this one doesn't have the tongue, this one has brass fittings that separate. So one feels as though one is in a space, but it's the same climate as the hall. The view to the window, back to celery top pine. Now, part of the ideas, again, I'm attempting to describe lots of things that one can consider that ultimately potentially get forgotten until one genuinely gets into the depth of the architecture and understanding the decisions. Whether it be concrete or timber, an idea of how one thinks that they're outside is, you can extend it to think, well, how does one make a window? Do you make a window so you can see the sashes, you can see the casements or the sliders or whatever, or does one think about a detail where the window and all the frames disappear? And that's what this house does. And we did that thinking that if one can set up a system where it's almost frameless views and adjustable, then it almost becomes an idea of it's an opening one is looking through, and it's absolutely very powerful in some cases where one looks through an opening. And again, it's difficult for the uninitiated or people who haven't been there, you wonder whether, am I inside or outside? Am I looking through a hole, or am I looking through like a window wall that one can close and operate? And those details are shown here. Pragmatic, the cross-section of that part of the window, the same window. I described how one occupies the edge. There's a series of invention here, or things that we worked on with the builder and with glazing contractors. The glass in this project is in some ways structural. There are sort of 90-degree planes in the glass to ensure that, like this amazing example here, how the glass is spanning between studs and studs. One has to think about and clearly there's consideration that ultimately influences perception of the building, subliminally or actually consciously. In the idea of how one is making a landscape, then the pragmatic requirement that helps sort of sets that in motion, if you like, in this instance, is a horizontal trellis, which is outside, which one sees from the arrival point, which when one looks through the window from the previous image actually controls the foreground. So this has dual role, and you see it here in sort of some detailing. So this is, I think, the first image. I think I do have another one. I'm a little bit out of order if one's confused, but this is the arrival point in the house, an older image prior to the landscape being firmly established. One arrives past 2 levels of security and arrives in this space. It really is like a town square. It's like arriving in this courtyard here. And from that place you then make your decision of where you then go. You can cross the court and decide whether to go to A, B or C. If one, and it seems everything does need to have a sort of entry, if one wants to make an entry door, it is this, that is into the hall. I described previously about how this massive opening opens completely, just revealing a concrete opening with some timber linings. Likewise, that door is detailed as though it's a gate. So the hall on the other side of this, which I described previously, which is underpinned by the idea of once you actually enter the house, when am I really inside and when am I not? Because you actually arrive in this space and you know you've arrived, but you very much are outside under a roof, and a very room-like experience. In selecting all of the celery top pine and going through that timber list that I mentioned previously, there was only a certain amount and certain sizes. We ensured that the largest pieces were held until this moment. I think it's the most significant sort of moment of arrival, if you like, and there are some 300 by 50 millimetre pieces of celery top pine that you see here drawn and ultimately in situ. And they too have been detailed where there are gaps in those boards, but in this instance being true enclosure with a translucent tongue. So in this instance, very big boards, some horizontal rails, some brass reinforcing strips, which for those who care can see it in the detail, all of which is actually expressed to become the thing that people respond to. So construction is absolutely firmly part of the aesthetic of the building. So much so that the things that could be hidden are expressed. Brass strips, which are reinforcing strips, are expressed in part of the detailing. Obviously the handle is part which I'll show you next. From the interior, there's very purpose-made parts how if it is a gate and one is trying to make openings apertures which are openings and not doors, and therefore having reveals that are not rebated, I'll get this right, I'm sorry about this. This is a plan of the detail. Here's a timber jamb that's inset into the concrete, and on the other side this is the door, and there's a sort of closing piece of brass that when the door pivots it opens and allows one to make a detail which you can't see it in the image, I'm afraid, so far away, but it extends the idea, the craft and the intelligence of how it was put together reinforces the intent, if you like, for it to seem as though it's a gate. And even in this instance, how one makes handles, and I think as a little anecdote again about participating in this process, if one has an idea that one is participating with others, I wouldn't know how to put it, and I didn't know how to put it together previously. We worked with others, we worked with these two individuals, brass paneling and so forth. But the idea comes from one which is about the building in use and the comfort of occupation. If ever one was going to sort of demonstrate that, and there's a whole history of it in architecture that we know, and this is sort of an extension of it in our little moment of the world, how that can be sort of understood and sort of resonate through the quality of the building. I should have had them up before, but as I mentioned, 2 people were beyond our client naturally, but 2 people on site besides ourselves. There are probably 4 people in our office: myself, Timothy Hill, Michael Hogg, federal medic. Some were working on the building. 2 people who really had their skills, and we were able to set the scene for them. I think the next question is, how do they understand the sort of ambition for the place? How is it that they get across the line and understand that they really are going to be putting all of their efforts and all of their knowledge into this building? And that's part of, I think, of working in a group of people and being able to understand those things and promote that entire idea, how this is an opportunity for us to demonstrate our skills, not for its own sake, but for the qualities that have been asked on behalf of the proprietor. So, and then if one is asked to do that, what better way of actually making an enduring quality than actually having it developed through the way the house is put together. I can talk about lots and lots of things involved with it. The outdoor space as it is at the moment at the point of arrival. I think there's one more set of images about this house which are about this box, which is an adjunct room to the main bedroom. So you can see obviously it looks through the outdoor room to the city. So it is about a view, but it's way more than being about a view. It's how it actually is part of a composition of space, or adds to this composition of parts within the courtyard. Some other things before we get onto it. It is also celery top pine. These are offcuts of the New Zealand kauri. So when we were profiling timbers and there was a pile of timber, then everything actually was used, because everything is very, very precious. Nothing was thrown away. Its functional role is that of sound attenuation. Being a building it has a road some down the hill, road noise coming up, and there's some soundproofing behind it. So everything has this required sort of output, if you like, and then how can one extend that and develop that to contribute to an overall composition. Clearly, when one looks at this from the outside, it's a set of elaborated structures. It's sat underneath the light. It extends the idea of a landscape. What really is it from this space? To look at it in cross section here, this is the outside from where the photograph is taken. Here is the interior, which I'll show you directly. Things that show up on it are really absolutely by necessity, and I can see them occurring in this house too. About Michael Markham and I were talking about, there's an opening door in this sub-room here, which for the children it's a very large door that can swing out wide to therefore make privacy in this room. Some simple things that through the action of use that become absolutely clear once they're in place. In this instance, that is the main bedroom. Here is the public room of the house. One does need to establish privacy, and this horizontal projection does that. In addition to that, of course, it's very light reactive and is demonstrative of the idea of like a trellis that has become an occupied place. From the interior, it's a smooth line building, but it actually is an occupied room. And so functionally what it does, clearly it needs to, or not clearly, but it's a window to the view. There's some fixed glass and some ventilation panels. It is an insect-proof room, so there are insect provisions in this. It's also a bed space. One can sleep here. Going back to the cross-section, I should have pointed out, but there is a hole above it, so you can slide back a hatch and you can sleep here under the stars, very subtropic. And also only the owner of the building can actually get onto the roof. It is concrete as well, so this is the way of getting onto the roof. So it has a whole lot of functional demands rendered in a certain way. And since then, I didn't have a photograph, I'm sorry, but there's a TV, but there is actually a bed here. Also functionally, it's almost the primary space in the room, the concrete room, which maybe you noticed previously, and those who know it, the room itself is only, I think, 3.2 metres wide. but long, so it has two settings for furniture, plus this space, which is a main way of occupying the space. So in addition to all those things I've described, it's also storage. So in underneath, I did it again, in underneath here are storage panels. So I'm going to check my time because somebody's going to keep their eye on me. How much time do I have? I'll go quickly. So then how does one extend that thinking into other buildings? And I talked about, 10, 20 minutes, yeah. How does one extend that thinking into sort of larger scale buildings? It's a question that's asked about people who do a lot of residential work and think about, well, that's all very well and good, but how do I pull that off when we're involved in larger things? This is Santos House in Brisbane. The real thing about it is really we were trying to make a Queensland building within a very strict sort of corporate and development sort of structure. I mentioned this thing about making a sphere of influence. We're in the very early days, we think within the Queensland process to actually have this set of values, if you like, that everybody effectively signs off on and one can always refer to be able to go forwards. What is it that makes a building in our setting that one can keep coming back to? I'll stop doing it, I'm sorry. Colour was something that we introduced very early on, and there's a whole history of colour in buildings which one can say that it's contemporary or whoever one wants to describe, but the fact there is a fact about a history of architecture with colour. The Queensland building, the way that one needs to, a modulated building, you recognise the things here that's not ours. Anybody from ARM will forgive me, but it's a great example of actually people thinking about the way buildings can work with modulation. The tectonic, and I think that's the core idea of what we're talking about here, is how you build buildings and how they become the identity of the building. And although we called it ornament, what we're talking about and what we were talking about then, and it's still valid, how one can include motifs that sort of have resonance at all scales of the building. So we developed this with our client and the team, and that was all endorsed. Colours of the building were developed out of a palette which was sort of based on Federation colourings of Brisbane. Other examples about history of buildings. How do you make a building in Queensland when all the pressures are about economy and efficiency and leasing? How do you make a building of its place? And in this instance worked with sort of a colour scheme which is very much about the place, the local stone and the local landscape. Our original model, which I think demonstrated those ideas about tectonic, the way that facades can be very different. It is a circumstantial building. A building isn't understood in the round. A building is understood from various points of view. So how does one extend that, the original model and how it ended up? So I think if one can, even within this context, uphold a set of influences, if you like, that everybody can adhere to, and I think I can certainly describe some correlations between this and the original model. So the building I won't go into that much, except that it's got a very sort of active, and Brisbane doesn't have many of them, sort of ground plan. The floor plan itself is just an absolutely ruthless commercial efficiency diagram, if you like. Maximum setback, minimum cause, maximum rent, maximum profit, all those things. We then worked with the way of how does one develop those ideas in facade making, various options about in situ precast, tack-on formwork, spandrel panels, but ultimately, because this was the significant thing about this one is it is a design and construct process, so we are working in a secondary role to the builder. The builder is telling us what to do, so importantly, early on in the process, trying to identify and have everybody support the ideas of the building, but still to be able to find how the builder wants to actually render those ideas. And in this instance, like 99% of the buildings in Brisbane, although we tried, it ultimately became a curtain wall system. And so that curtain wall system, the builder wants to get up as quickly as possible, get the rent, etc., etc. So we developed ideas about how the idea of modulation, it's not only the way the building looks, it does have, which I should have mentioned, a genuine ESD value. The two elevations on which it appears are the ones which have the low sun in Brisbane, so it is actually it is protecting the building, if you like. Developing those ideas with our client earlier on. Developing them further still at this point about talking about perforated elements in the elevation, but allowing for the enclosure of the building to be built very quickly. Through the process, when I talked about a sphere of influence, I'm referring to authorities as well. So there's an approval process which is critical, and therefore the milieu in which one works is very influential, and the authorities are obviously influential in this setting. So the set of drawings were made which actually ultimately became a prototype, and it's not quite tongue-in-cheek, but we got to the point about saying, well, how on earth are we going to not make solid panels, but how are we going to extend the idea that we had set ourselves about making a motif that was recognisable in its place. So this prototype was made, which is a zigzag in plan, and so therefore as the light strikes it moves across the sky. Sometimes it appears as a solid, on other occasions it's very, very transparent, and that was set up to suit the sun path and the protection. But then how to actually achieve that in a motif. This one is like a, one might reckon, Federation sort of motif of balustrades and so forth. Anyway, the point about this is that we do lots of things that then get dumped, including this was thrown out as an idea. And so I think there's lots of things in buildings that there's a lot of research and a lot of things that get discarded, which we've all understand. We went back to an original idea through a process of working with these people, which was much like the original model of having a strip panel and some light reactive blobs in elevation. The light reactive protrusions ultimately were removed, and we developed this scheme. And we're able to think about it again with the group of people who are actually making it. So we had to be, in this instance, it's not a matter of us as designers giving instructions and saying it will work. It's us as designers setting the scene and setting ambition and working with the fabricators who are actually making this stuff to see what is possible in an economical regime. So in a sense, it's very much like the previous building, but obviously not in its refined nature, but the same process essentially. The process of installation, acceptance, always with people. And just very quickly, the other building, it's exactly the same thing. How is it in a building which is also a Brisbane building? There's two things here which are very particular on this very commercial building. These light shades and a brick building. Again, extremely efficient diagram. The building does respond to an urban diagram, the way that the city and the streets work. The way that a building is understood as a top, middle and base, but very much from where we see it, the impact of these elevations on the street is a critical part of the understanding of the building, and therefore that's where the effort needs to go. And I'm leading up into these two elements here. Ultimately, and again, what is the pragmatic requirements include sun shading, a urban response, and particularly with the concrete building, how it is in a setting a setting that does include other brick buildings in the street, developing that with the contractors based on a sort of set of ambition drawings. They're very, very rudimentary, yet at the same time very characteristic. They are only just U shapes of concrete. They do become emblematic in the interior. They are scaled to suit the ESD requirement, but also with the person. And just finally, very quickly, the same idea in this little brick building that, as I mentioned previously, does sit in a setting of brick buildings. It does make sense when you're there about how it contributes not to the building itself only, but also to the setting, the wider setting of the buildings. And prior to starting this, we all have ambition of how one does a beautiful brick building. We could never have done this as individuals. We could only do it as a group of people, including the engineers and the bricklayers, including the brick Institute who worked with us on this and developed a series of, put us in touch with the right people so that we could make these things out of different brick types. And that's my final slide. Thank you very much.